Washington, D.C.
Tonight, losing faith. President Trump says he's losing confidence in Iranian negotiators, teasing more strikes now against Tehran as the conflict drags on. CBS now reporting strikes on energy infrastructure could come as soon as this weekend. We'll talk it out with Aaron David Miller, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We'll talk about the war and a new framework aimed at demilitarizing the Gaza Strip. And that's a wrap. A volatile session capping a turbulent week and month for stocks, roiled by Chair Warsh's Fed message, the war with Iran, and a split verdict on big tech's massive AI investments. And breaking after the bell now, Warsh reportedly considering reducing the number of Fed policy meetings in what would be a major shakeup for the central bank. Speaking of AI, shoot for the Moonshot. A new Chinese AI model is raising fresh questions about whether U.S. chip controls are slowing China's technological advance. Bloomberg reporting shows how Beijing is still tapping American technology to compete with the world's leading AI systems. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons.
And, Joe, we kick off tonight's coverage with the first at Camp David. President Trump convened the first ever televised cabinet meeting from inside the presidential retreat, taking questions on everything from the economy and Congress to, of course, the war with Iran. The president renewing his threat of further strikes.
We'll be hitting them. We'll be hitting them very hard. And, at some point they're going to say, we just can't take it anymore. They're being decimated. They have no Navy, they have no Air Force, they have no anti-aircraft. Doesn't mean they don't have any capability.
And CBS now reporting the U.S. and Israel are planning what would be one of the harshest bombing campaigns to date against energy infrastructure targets in Iran, with strikes possible throughout the weekend. Joining us now for more from the North Lawn of the White House is Bloomberg's Jeff Mason. So, Jeff, if we're talking energy infrastructure here, this obviously would be a big escalation, and one that likely would come with political consequence and market consequence, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely, Kaylee. And in terms of the consequences, that's something that has dogged the president from the very beginning of this war, with the impact on energy prices and the increase in oil and gasoline prices having political ramifications for him going into the midterms. But the president has largely dismissed that as a concern whenever we ask him about that, saying that this is a broader goal and that he's proud to take it on and to do something that previous presidents haven't done. But in terms of that CBS report and even the foreshadowing that you just played from the president's quote at Camp David, he's clearly looking at additional strikes, and this war is obviously going to keep going probably for some time.
I want to ask you about the president's anti-weaponization fund, if it still exists. Jeff, kind of hard to tell after the conversation that we heard today at Camp David when reporters asked him about this. Of course, this is the very reason why his attorney general nominee did not get a confirmation vote this week, with some senators, including Tom Tillis and John Cornyn, who want a written guarantee that it's dead. The president was asked about this. Here's what he said.
Do you agree with the acting attorney general that the anti-weaponization fund is dead? And why not just put that in writing?
It is dead, but, I wish it weren't, to be honest with you. I think people were horribly treated, horribly abused. This has nothing to do with that. This was me. Horribly abused. And I'd like to see them compensated for the pain. They lost their families. They committed suicide. Many people committed suicide. They went down for an innocent journey. And I'm not only talking there, I'm talking about not even having to do with that. The way they were treated. The Biden administration and the Obama administration weaponized government and destroyed lives.
So, Jeff Mason, if the president wishes it weren't dead, is it?
Yeah, I think that's a very astute question, Joe. And I think if you are a cabinet member, particularly if you are the acting attorney general, and you hear him say, I wish it weren't dead, that sounds a lot like a signal that he wants it to be revived, or at least to stay on life support, which would explain why he is openly considering taking the nomination for Todd Blanche as the actual attorney general, or as a confirmed attorney general, off the table for now. It's kind of like saying the quiet part out out loud that that is, in fact, or it looks like that's perhaps behind his thinking about not wanting to push this nomination because he doesn't want to risk giving up parts of that deal, including both the fund for people who were involved in January 6th and others that he believes were targeted by the Biden administration, and that IRS tax deal for his family.
Just quickly, Jeff, before we talk to Aaron David Miller, the president was also asked about this new framework, this deal with Hamas to demilitarize the Gaza Strip. Is this a formal deal?
Well, yeah, I was glad that he got asked about that, because there are times when this president or this White House may announce something that's not fully baked in, and that may be the case here, because Israel came out and said that it was not going to change its position unless Hamas did, and those two sides have not confirmed that this is a done deal. So that's my answer to your question. The president has painted it as a big breakthrough, and the White House has, and if it were finished, then it would be. But you need to have confirmation from those two parties to make that clear.
Great to have you, as always. Jeff Mason, live from the White House. Have a great weekend, Jeff. With us now for more is Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's always great to have you, Aaron, on Bloomberg TV and radio. We obviously have a lot to talk about here, and I would love your thoughts on a demilitarized Gaza Strip. This breaking news, though, from CBS suggesting the president has yet to give final go orders for a strike, but they are looking at what would be one of the harshest bombing campaigns to date. If he does green light this mission, will it make a difference?
Well, let me link the two. If the CBS reports are true, that the Israelis and the Americans will resume and escalate and expand their target sets to energy infrastructure, then several things are going to happen. You're going to get retaliatory strikes by the Iranians on Gulf infrastructure. To some degree, they've done that already, but we haven't seen the sort of massive destruction focused on energy entrepôts, pipelines, refineries, some of it. That's number one. Number two, if the Israelis get involved, it's almost inevitable that they will resume their strikes against Hezbollah, and Hezbollah, acting in concert with Iran, is going to strike northern Israel. Pro-Iranian Iraqi militias will get involved in this fray. The Houthis already have demonstrated their capacity to block a second checkpoint. So yes, inflationary cycles, the price of oil is going to skyrocket. And the real question here, you could forget any progress in Gaza, which frankly, given the circumstances, as far as I see it, was a sort of thought experiment anyway, because Hamas is not going to significantly demilitarize until the Israelis commit to withdrawal, and the Israelis are not going to commit to withdrawal. So these strikes, if they're true, the CBS report, will focus on the main event, which is not Gaza. It's how to extricate the United States from this war. The core question is, will this ramping up an expansion of the target set change Iran's calculations on the core issues? Will it produce enough pain to produce a different Iranian approach to the Straits of Hormuz? Or is it simply going to convince them that this is an existential struggle that is designed to change the regime and to basically harden their positions? I think we really are at a moment here that could see a major and drastic expansion of this war on the weekend.
So regional war could be the end result if the president gives the go-ahead for this, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it already, but we haven't seen all of its component parts energized and activated at the same time. The Israeli-Lebanese front, Iran striking Israeli population centers, the Israelis responding with their own ballistic missile inventories against Iran, Iran striking Gulf civilian infrastructure and energy infrastructure. The Houthis trying to close the Bab el-Mandeb, which is the second choke point. I mean, we haven't seen all of that. And if that's what the president wants to visit on the Iranians, I think we all better be prepared for what's to follow.
Well, this could be a heck of a weekend, Aaron David Miller. Should every Middle Eastern nation that's been struck so far expect to be hit again in that world? I'm talking about Egypt. I'm talking about Kuwait, Jordan, UAE. This would be a regional war pretty quickly in the scenario that you're
anywhere
outlining.
that there's an American military base. Jordan, Kuwait. The Iranians have spared, at least over the next past few weeks, the Emiratis. We have a very important air base there.
And
but
Iran
yeah,
has the
I think
missiles
you're
to
gonna
do all of that?
Further strikes on U.S. military bases. But again, the Gulf is the point of leverage for the Iranians. And I wonder, to the degree to which the administration is briefing and preparing the Gulf states for what's coming, unless this, guys, is just some elaborate psyops on the part of the administration, the latest effort to somehow press the Iranians into believing that if they don't give up their core position on the straits, they want to turn it into an ATM machine, that they'll have to use any number of the president's expletives. They're going to be hit very seriously, unless this is psychological ops. But frankly, I don't think rhetoric will do it. If that's what the administration wants to do, to escalate along the lines that CBS is indicating, and involving the Israelis in this, which the president, I think, had been reluctant to do all along. We're in for a whole new sort of, well, we've turned the page in a different kind of war.
Well, I guess we'll have to see what this weekend brings. To return to the subject of Israel and Hamas and Gaza, Aaron, you were describing how Hamas, before de-arming itself, wants to make sure Israel withdraws. Israel has its own conditions on that. It seems, not to belittle it, but that this is a real chicken and egg kind of issue in terms of what ultimately has to come first. So what's the likelihood that this actually works out as the president has described?
I think it's, frankly, very unlikely. The basic problem all along with all of these ceasefires and well-intentioned agreements on Gaza is that the basic challenge is to reconcile this Israeli government's vision for Gaza with Hamas's vision. And frankly, over the last 3 years, every ceasefire has essentially cratered or not been able to move forward and expand because of this problem. And Hamas is, remember, you have Hamas tunnel infrastructure, which is probably, the Israelis have destroyed quite a bit, but it may still be, what, 40% as long as the New York subway system? You have Hamas laboratories making IEDs. You have Hamas weapons factories, homegrown to be sure. You have smuggling. Hamas's mission is struggle, and also inflicting through terror a level of pain on the Israelis that on October 7th they have never experienced before. And Hamas is going to be reluctant to give all of that up. I think they want to throw the ball into the Israeli court to see whether or not Donald Trump couldn't or wouldn't press Netanyahu to withdraw. But if Trump is now enlisting Israel as a partner in a ramped up military campaign, the last thing he's going to want to do is to try to pressure the Israelis to withdraw from Gaza. And the Israelis, if in fact you do see this escalation, will be battening down the hatches for their own protection and the prospects of additional terror strikes throughout the region, by the way, against our assets as well.
I don't know how wide you're willing to open the aperture here in our lens, Aaron, but there was an event this week that caught a lot of people by surprise when Ukraine decided to strike an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea. Should we be including actions like this when Iran decides to make good on its retribution list?
I mean, possibly, but the Iranians are going to be spread pretty thin, particularly if the Israelis join this fight right now. And I think, look, the IRGC, the guys running the railroad, the guys who control the guns, the money, the oil, they now believe, and if we escalate, and I suspect the president may well, that this will for them mean what they have thought all along: regime change. They're out to break the regime. And if that's the case, I suspect they're going to want to double down and drill down in order to protect their assets and inflict the maximum amount of pain that they can on the points of vulnerability that they now control, which is to encourage. The Houthis are not on automatic pilot. They're not traditional proxies. But Iran, I suspect, if hit along the lines that the CBS report suggests, the Houthis will double down as well on the Straits. Pro-Iranian militias will begin to strike American assets in Iraq, and you're going to end up with an Israeli-Hezbollah war to boot.
Well, as we're having this conversation, Aaron, some fresh reporting just hit from the Wall Street Journal that President Trump has ordered a fresh attack on Iran that could begin as soon as this weekend and would last, according to U.S. officials that the Journal is citing here, a few days. Now, it's unclear whether or not this would be the energy infrastructure that CBS was reporting about, but the Wall Street Journal is saying here that Trump has ordered these fresh attacks. And I wonder what you will be watching for over the course of the next few days, if indeed this happens, the first signs of retaliation that you might expect. I know you talked about all of the different areas in which this could expand, but where is Iran likely to try to strike first?
Again, they can't vertically escalate. They can't match the U.S. or Israeli military missile for missile, drone for drone, but they can and they will focus on what folks call horizontal escalation. It's maximizing their geographic advantage and weaponizing geography. It will most likely be U.S. military bases, key Gulf states, if the administration goes after infrastructure. I'd also point out why would the administration want to put out, if in fact this is really a ramping up? Why do they want to say that this would go on for a few days? I mean, this is serious stuff, but I just, having worked for Republicans and Democrats and voted for Republicans and Democrats, I just sort of don't understand the public messaging here. It seems to suggest that the president really doesn't want, it's a few days rather than 2 weeks, which is the time frame of choice for the administration and for the president. It's 2 weeks this, 2 weeks that. Why would he want to do that? If he really, really wants to get their attention, he'd leave it open-ended on the assumption that this is going to be a campaign that would last weeks, if not months. And it sort of suggests that there's a real risk aversion piece of this. Look, guys, I think that the reality is we're stuck in a box. And the president has two options, neither of which he wants to accept. Number one is massive escalation, including perhaps the deployment of ground forces to seize Iranian territory, to use them as negotiation pawns in any further negotiation. He doesn't want to do that in a 4 or 5 month long campaign. The other, he doesn't want to allow the Iranians to basically control the Straits. So he's not prepared to cut a deal which gives them that advantage. So he's left with what you see, which is the middle option, which doesn't change Iran's calculation and won't.
All right, we'll leave it there. Aaron David Miller of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. As we turn to Wall Street, managed to finish a rather turbulent week with some gains as a rally in Amazon helped to offset losses in Apple, along with rising Treasury yields and higher oil prices. Let's get details in Power Moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda live from New York. Nora?
The end of a turbulent month on Wall Street. We did see stocks ending higher on the day. We saw the S&P 500 up about 0.7%. The Nasdaq 100 following closely behind, up about 0.6%. But this was a really bumpy month. We did see essentially AI euphoria meeting reality. Questions as to whether or not this spending on artificial intelligence is justified, and not so much the spending, but the companies that are actually making money back from it. That's where the focus was really. And we saw the Nasdaq, of course, taking a bit of a beating this month, down about more than 6%. But where the focus was chip makers. We saw the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index down more than 20%. actually seeing its worst month since 2008. So there was a large emphasis there. And not only in the equity market, we did, of course, see stocks finishing decently on the end of the month, but there was a bit more of a cautious story when you take a look at the Treasury market. We saw yields continuing to climb. The Fed, of course, leaving rates unchanged, and that really begging the question about where inflation sits right now, knowing that we did get a cooler than expected inflation report. But what that means for the bond market, especially when we think about the long end yields sitting still at their highest level since 2007. So stocks essentially heard AI earnings, the bond market seeing inflation as not necessarily dead. And then we've also got what's going on in the Middle East, that continuing to be in focus. We see Brent crude currently sitting around $90 a barrel. That headline just coming through on the Bloomberg terminal that Trump ordering an attack on Iran as soon as this weekend. The focus now going toward next week, where we're going to get earnings out of names like Palantir, AMD, and SpaceX.
It's going to be a big week again. Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, thank you so much. And we did get breaking news on the Fed in the last hour. The New York Times reporting that Chair Kevin Warsh is considering reducing the frequency of policy meetings at which the Fed sets interest rates to potentially fewer than the current 8 times a year. The Times reporting that Warsh raised the idea at the Fed's meeting this week and left the impression that a revised schedule could be decided on before their next meeting in mid-September, even if the changes would not be carried out until later. All of this according to 4 people with knowledge of the discussion. And with us now for more in our Washington bureau is Bloomberg's Enda Curran. So we know, Enda, that this chairman wants the Fed to be communicating less. This pullback would be in keeping with that, but it would be certainly perhaps tumultuous for the market, which is used to getting more frequent messaging from the Fed.
It would be a big move, and certainly the biggest move by new chairman Kevin Warsh so far. As you mentioned, coming via the New York Times, at the moment the Fed is meant to hold a minimum of 4 meetings a year. They hold 8. It's down to the chairman for when they set the schedule of those meetings. 3 others on the Fed committee can also, by the way, call a meeting. They can put down a date for that. But if this does go ahead, and if the Fed chairman does reduce the number of meetings, it comes at a time when, as you say, they're getting blowback for trying to minimise communications under Fed Chairman Warsh. He wants less speeches, less press conferences. And it comes at a time when the Fed is under pressure for not being seen to do enough on inflation at a time when inflation remains well above their target. So it could be a hard sell to the public, this move.
Obviously, we don't know exactly what he's going to do here or how many meetings they'll end up having, but directionally speaking, it's been a change of course here from what was many years of increasing transparency, adding the news conference. Remember, that was a huge deal when that happened with Bernanke, introducing the dot plot, some of the other things that we've seen. This would sort of codify that turn to a more discreet Fed?
It would. It certainly would gel with Chairman Warsh's public pronouncements that he wants, less is more.
Yeah.
Now, to be clear, there are plenty of people who say there is too much Fed speak at the moment. Mm-hmm. Too many officials are out there speaking. You don't need all this communication. Just tell us what's important and when. So there is a case for that. But nonetheless, getting the balance right between overkill on Fed speak and then falling into the trap of being accused of lacking transparency, that's a very tricky one. And clearly, Chairman Warsh is going to have to tread carefully on that.
We just have 30 seconds left, but we got statements from the dissenters at this week's meeting. What was the common thread through the 3 of them?
Bottom line is they feel inflation is too high. They feel the Fed needs to act and act soon. And that's why a lot of people are thinking there's pressure on the Fed to raise interest rates again at some point over the coming months.
Great to have you, Enda, as always, with breaking news. Bloomberg's Enda Curran live in Washington with us here on Balance of Power. Coming up, another big story today. Moonshot back in the headlines, inking a deal with Alibaba to use some 20,000 chips made by Nvidia, despite the administration's restriction on China using Nvidia's tech. How'd it get there? What the president has to say about it? And more on the current tech landscape straight ahead on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Nvidia, they have a chip. They say you cannot copy it. The complexity is so great you cannot. Most things you copy. China's known for it, other countries, we do something, and I guess we copy also. Most things you can copy pretty easily. There's a chip that they made, their ultimate chip.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines. President Trump there talking to reporters at a meeting today at Camp David, a cabinet meeting, commenting there on Nvidia's chips after we got word of a computing power agreement between Chinese AI champion Moonshot and Alibaba for the use of around 20,000 Nvidia chips. The U.S., of course, has restricted China's access to Nvidia chips, and a White House official accused Moonshot of illegally acquiring these, Nvidia's most advanced Blackwell chips in this case. The news today coming just after Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang spent the last couple days here in Washington meeting with the president and lawmakers. And for more, we bring in Bloomberg's Michael Shepard in our Washington, D.C. bureau. 20,000 Blackwells? How could this have happened?
Well, a lot of different ways. There is the prospect, of course, that the chips were actually brought into China, but more likely they were offshore. They were in a Southeast Asian country, perhaps Thailand, perhaps someplace else. We don't know exactly where these chips under this agreement are cited, but companies like Alibaba and Tencent in China have been able to access Nvidia computing power, including some of the products that are restricted for sale to China, to locations in China, to Chinese entities, but you can lease that computing power on a rental basis.
Well, of course, there was a lot of concern about this model being able to do what U.S. models could do cheaply, perhaps in an open way in which would threaten others or would at least spark some more concern about China's AI power. I want to talk, though, about the powerful models here in the U.S. that seem to be capable of doing a lot more than the companies trying to control them want them to do. We already knew about OpenAI's model being able to essentially break out of its controlled environment to inadvertently hack Hugging Face. Then now we have news that Anthropic's Claude also was able to access the internet when it wasn't supposed to be and conduct a number of hacks. How do they get guardrails around this? Why are they capable of doing those things?
Well, they had the guardrails in place. And the thing is that in each of these instances, they were testing environments. These models were placed in what they call sandboxes, where they weren't supposed to get out and get onto the internet and go other places. The instructions were, you stay here and you work in this testing environment to solve the problem at hand. And yet they were trying so hard to solve the problem that they decided to break out. And in the case of the Hugging Face exploit that OpenAI ultimately divulged, Hugging Face is a repository of AI models. So if you want to test whether you can hack an AI model, well, where do you go? You go to Hugging Face, except it violated what it had been told. And if you want to think about it, it's sort of like a toddler. Don't leave the sandbox, and yet it goes off running. And that is one of the things that, you know, the administration is wrestling with and the companies themselves are wrestling with. And we've heard various tunes, especially from Dario Amodei over the past several years, calling for more safety testing and more guardrails on these products. But even this week, we saw Sam Altman, who has been less outspoken about this kind of structure approach, talking to lawmakers and administration officials about the need to pace the development of artificial intelligence, really in light of these kinds of episodes.
We saw 3 different companies hacked here without anyone knowing about it. But just to be clear, these were being tested without the additional safeguards that Anthropic would put on publicly available models, right? So do we understand that if those safeguards were in place, these 3 companies would not have been hacked?
That is correct. Okay. That is the understanding. But the concern is, though, that if you have access to one of these models, and this actually goes back to our discussion about Moonshot. Moonshot is an open weight model, and that means you can download the parameters. If you have a model like that Mythos model or a Claude Opus 4.7 model that you can download and perhaps remove some of the safety guardrails and parameters, well, then we're off to the races, Joe. And that is one of the concerns. And that is one of the differences between the two systems, the open weight approach being favored by most of these Chinese companies, and for now the predominant approach here in the U.S., which is to favor the closed system, which many say offers a little bit more security. And yet in this case, we see that there are still security concerns surrounding their products, even in their internal testing environments.
All right, Bloomberg's Michael Shepard. Thank you so much. And with us now for more is Laura Galante, former director of the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. She's currently a principal at West Exec Advisors. Laura, we want to talk to you more about Moonshot and some of these questions around AI, but I would like to begin, if we can, with the breaking news we've been dealing with this hour. The Wall Street Journal reporting President Trump has ordered new strikes against Iran. CBS reporting that those strikes could be targeting energy infrastructure specifically. And we were just having a conversation with Aaron David Miller about how Iran will likely try to retaliate, not necessarily vertically, but horizontally in the region. I just wonder if you might expect that that retaliation could potentially include asymmetric strikes, things like cyber attacks. Is that something the United States should be prepared for?
Yeah, it's been a concern the entire time that the Iran war has been waged, that one of the ways that the Iranian military can get to the U.S. is through cyber attacks. And there's good precedent for that. Even when there isn't a hot war going on, we've seen a variety of different cyber attacks where Iranian groups will go after industrial control systems specifically, the interface that you use to control a water plant, for example, and go in and change the controls. We saw this for years after the October 7th attack in Israel. A bunch of different industrial control systems were hacked by Iranian groups. So certainly a concern, and the industrial sector here in the U.S. and a lot of the equipment manufacturers are very much on high alert for the possibility of this type of retaliatory action.
Yeah, well, just the news today, according to our intelligence agencies, that Iran was likely behind the cyber attack on more than 30 municipal water systems in Minnesota. The president today suggested that this was Minnesota's own problem. But is this the type of thing we could see more of? And to what extent can we defend ourselves against it?
The type of attack you're seeing in Minnesota is really widespread, and there are some really good defensive measures that defenders need to put in place. One of the issues here is that when you have a device that connects a physical system to the internet, and an attacker can get in and change that physical system through the controls online, that's where you've got this jump from the cyber world to the physical world, and you see issues like water tanks getting overflows, changes in chlorine level, really scary stuff. So for anyone who's out there operating any of these systems that have that physical cyber touch, it's really important to do the basics. Change the default passwords, make sure there's multi-factor authentication. The agencies have been saying this for years, but it's all the more important now because so many of these systems are relatively newly hooked up to the internet. It's a 5-6 year thing in some cases, and it's a really important part of the attack surface from the Iranian side that they could go after here in the U.S.
Well, hence the push to bring it back to the conversation around AI to try to get a hold on models that potentially can exploit and identify cyber vulnerabilities.
Well, and it works both ways. There's a lot of advancement in the ability to go find what vulnerable systems are out there and patch them as well. So certainly it's something where you've got to be able to find where are the unlocked doors, if you will, in the digital system, and how do you go and patch them at scale, close them at scale so that you've got a safer operating picture across the country.
So it brings us to what might happen on Sunday, Laura. The White House is reportedly set to meet a deadline to release this framework for AI regulation. And I'm wondering what your expectation is. We've taken a couple swings at this, and the president's made clear they do not want to block innovation or slow the race with China. And in fact, there will be no requirement to comply with these rules, realizing the companies themselves that would be adhering to these rules are writing them. Will this make any difference? Is this what the industry needs?
I think what we're going to see Sunday is a capture of where a lot of the conversation's been in the last 2-3 months, which is around what does responsible innovation look like in AI? And if you want to zoom out here for a second, you've got these 3 major frontier lab companies. You have OpenAI, you have Anthropic, and then you have Google with Gemini. And they're all in a race to innovate on their models. And they're also all in a race to figure out how do you have controls, guardrails, safety measures in place to make sure that they're not going to do something that they don't want the model to do. And you've seen the commerce action back in June that paused Anthropic's rollout of a model. So everyone's on a little bit of a trigger here to figure out what is the right way to do responsible innovation and still keep pushing the models forward. And that dialogue's been really loud and it's been very public. A lot of the companies, you mentioned this Hugging Face incident where OpenAI's model broke out and hacked another company, Anthropic. There's reporting on that happening there as well. So transparency, I think, is the other piece. And that's what I'm looking for on Sunday. Are AI companies and is the White House saying we need to be clear on when things go wrong and we need to understand in this evolving atmosphere, how do we make this safer?
Well, so as we consider safety and what some of these labs are trying to do around it, it's those very same labs, in the case of at least OpenAI and Anthropic, who seem less eager, if you will, around this whole conversation around open weight models. And I wonder, Laura, what your take is.
I actually think everyone from the sort of compute side of the house to the closed models and labs have been interestingly supportive of the open weight system. And just to zoom out for a second on that, open weight models, you're able to go in, download the model for yourself, download the weight for yourself as the customer, and then go and use it and tailor it to your system versus the closed model where you're accessing it through OpenAI or Anthropic, right? And this open model and open weight ecosystem is really important in the U.S. to keep driving at. And I actually think in the last couple of days, you've seen a lot of signals from even the closed labs to say we need a more flourishing open weight system. And that's a little bit of a interesting point to see where China's gone, where they've really doubled down on an open weight system. So more to come on how that debate plays out.
This comes along with a debate around export controls. Laura, you might have heard our conversation about Moonshot. It's funny how all these stories end up connecting somehow. 20,000 Nvidia chips said to be used by Moonshot by way of Alibaba. Did the U.S. do something wrong here? Was this diversion through another country? What do you make of it?
Look, the facts are still coming out on this one, but the fact that Moonshot, which is very much a Beijing competitor to a lot of the models and labs that we have in the U.S., had the compute access to these 20,000 super powerful chips is fascinating. I think it is a worry here that the rules that were put in place earlier in January 26, around who gets access and how rental of that compute can work need another look. And with all export controls, you conceptually know that you can't get to 100%. You can't put up a digital wall, for example, to keep China from getting chips, but you can slow down their progress. And that's what this race is about. And that's the leverage point that the U.S. government has against China on this AI race. And it's a little bit of the protection that can be given to companies here in the U.S. It's those really high-end chips, and China's trying desperately to figure out how they get to the next level on their own chips the same way.
Laura, it's great to have you back. Laura Galante, we thank you for the insights, as always, on Balance of Power. We turn back to breaking news now. Reports coming in just moments ago from the Wall Street Journal. The president ordering attacks on Iran for as soon as this weekend. A fresh attack that could last days, according to the Journal, while CBS News began the hour reporting that power plants and refineries are likely to be targeted in a new, heavier wave of attacks. We'll continue to follow the news as it develops with our eyes on the Middle East. Less than 100 days till the midterms now, 95 to be exact. The president has yet to sign off on spending any of his super PAC funds to help Republicans. What party strategists are telling Bloomberg coming up next on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for spending part of your Friday with us. The midterm elections, 95 days away. But who's counting? The president has still to authorize a plan to spend any of the more than $400 million that his super PAC has raked in from political donors. That's according to a Republican strategist speaking with Bloomberg. The report says the president's allies are, quote, increasingly worried Trump will not tap any of the money his MAGA Inc. super PAC has on hand to prop up vulnerable Republicans in House and Senate races. Perhaps that's why we saw news this week of Elon Musk's potential involvement yesterday, following reports the world's richest person plans to spend over $100 million in the upcoming midterms, up with door knocking and ground operations. Joining us now, our political panel to get to this and a lot more. Bloomberg politics contributor Jeannie Shanzano is with us, our Democratic analyst and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Republican strategist David Avella is with us as well. And great to see both of you here. David, what's your thought on this? The president going to open the spigot or not?
Yes, he will. And Joe, last time I checked, voters weren't screaming, show us more TV ads. We want more mail. Let's keep in mind that primaries aren't even over yet. We have Kansas next week and then Michigan, Florida, a few big states left to still do their primary elections. And so now, as much as those of us who follow politics and enjoy politics and work in politics are ready for the general, the reality is the primary is not over yet. And we can rest assured the president's going to do his part. It's why he sent his chief political person from being the White House political director and James Blair over to run the political campaign.
I understand your point that the primary is not over everywhere, David, but the primary is over in some pretty critical states. We know who's on the ballot in Texas. We know who's on the ballot in Maine. Would it not behoove this organization to start early in those places, knowing how critical they are?
Well, Kayleigh, ultimately, you want to be doing it when voters are actually paying attention. And there's no suggestion that right now in these summer months that folks are tuned in yet for the general election. And let's keep in mind that there is a really big one that hasn't been decided yet, which is Michigan. And a opportunity, certainly if El Said wins the Democratic nomination, which it looks like he will over Haley Stevens, it gives Mike Rogers a infinitely better chance at winning that U.S. Senate race and putting that into play. And let me just underscore it with one other thing. You're already starting to see the Democratic numbers come down. That when you had generic ballot 2 or 3 months ago that had them up at 8-9% favorable or lead over Republicans, that's now down to 4, and in some polls you even see it at 3. So as voters do start paying attention, we see movement much more towards the GOP, and we haven't even started advertising yet. And I would offer it's because of the extreme candidates the Democrats are nominating, DSAers.
Let's have you weigh in here, Jeannie, as we just heard a lot. We talked earlier today with Spencer Kimball from the Emerson College Polling Center. He's given El Sayed a 15-point lead over Haley Stevens in Michigan. Some people think that primary is as good as done. Are you one of them?
You know, I'm not sure yet, and I have to break David's heart and tell him I'm one of those people very excited about the general election.
You are,
Sorry,
huh?
David, yes. You know, El Sayed, he is a very strong candidate, but I wouldn't discount Haley Stevens just yet. She's got a lot of support, but let's face it, on the Democratic side, a lot of the energy is in those DSA candidates. And so he very well could carry this out. But, you know, in terms of the spending, Donald Trump famously gets a lot of earned media. He's somebody who doesn't like to pay for something he can get for free. Sure. He's getting a lot of that. And he is going to have to use that ability, but he's also going to have to spend because the Republicans are in a bad situation here. When you've got a president with approval ratings at 32, 33, 34%, inflation the way it is, you've got a state like Michigan, unemployment is 5%. They've lost manufacturing jobs in the auto sector since Donald Trump got back into office. Gas prices over $4 a gallon. I mean, the list goes on and on. Plus the history of this. They're going to need to spend to catch up to Democrats here. Can they do it? Sure they can, but they're going to have to spend money. Donald Trump does not like to do that, famously. But of course, to your point, Elon Musk is jumping in with $100 million, and that's like nothing for him.
Well, that's, I guess, for him, it's not.
Just on Michigan, Jeannie, this is obviously the final week of campaigning. What would Haley Stevens need to change over the course of the next 3 days before people go to the polls?
I don't think there's a lot she can do at this point. This is a race to get out the vote. And since the energy is on the left side, it's a real uphill battle for her. There were some polls early on showing her with a 7-point lead. That has dissipated now to Spencer Kimball's point. But, I think Republicans have more of a problem running against these Democratic socialist candidates than they're letting on. And just one example, Kayleigh, yesterday the Department of Commerce said that they were going to take equity stake in 7 IT companies. That is what? Nationalization of private companies. That is the stuff of socialism. So how are the Republicans going to explain that on the one hand and attacking Democrats as socialists and pinkos and commies when they themselves are doing it? And I don't even need to mention to you guys the issue of Intel. Yeah. So they've got themselves in a little bit of bind here as much as they want to run against, like it's the Red Scare days. They themselves are pushing some of these ideas forward as well.
Hey, David, I'm drawn to this memo from Doug Sosnick that's making the rounds today, predicting a blue wave election for Democrats. And the thesis is pretty simple. It sounds a lot like what Jeannie just said. Citing the party's overperformance in elections since 2024, the president's all-time low approval numbers, economic dissatisfaction. Is that something that Republicans can run against?
This election really boils down to 2 things, Joe. One, us presenting a plan about affordability and helping to continue to bring costs down, and the economic plan that has ultimately led to positive job growth with that, keeping taxes low, getting regulations at a point where businesses can flourish, jobs can be created, and add to that, reminding voters the choice and making every Democratic candidate for Congress have to answer the question is, do you agree with the DSA leaders who think we should get rid of the U.S. Senate? They've advocated for that. Do you believe that the Supreme Court should be abolished? Democratic socialists have advocated for that. Do you agree with the New York mayor that we should have government-run grocery stores? You give voters that choice, and we're going to be in a really good position to win these competitive seats. And as we talked about the last time I joined you, we actually have a chance to pick up seats in the U.S. Senate. If you look at New Hampshire, if you look at Michigan, that could be a net gain or a gain of 2. And then as we battle in these other states, we're very well in a position to actually pick up seats in the U.S. Senate.
Well, of course, the president's a little upset with the U.S. Senate as it is right now. He's not satisfied with the majority leader. He certainly would like to see the exits of John Cornyn and Tom Tillis accelerated. Jeannie, just quickly, do you expect that this Blanche anti-weaponization issue is going to be able to be resolved before the recess?
I don't think it's going to be resolved before the recess. Are we recessing any day now, right? Next Friday, right? So I don't see how it gets resolved unless the White House steps up or the DOJ steps up and issues that letter, and so far they haven't proven that they are willing to do that.
Yep, of course, the president said today he wishes the anti-weaponization fund weren't dead. Our thanks to tonight's political panel: Jeannie Shanzano, Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, and David Avella, GOPAC Chair and Republican Strategist. Thank you both. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here on Monday on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.